Okay, so I hope y'all have had a really good day so far and enjoyed talks in the morning. Hope you enjoyed the speaker panel. I hope you didn't feel like I was yelling at you about caring about CSS or learning about CSS. That's not about you because you're here. So I'm going to talk about, ostensibly I'm going to talk about style guide driven development. That's like a huge part of what I want to talk about. But I'm also going to drill in deep a little bit into how this plays into your team's process. So I'm Jan, hello. This information, if you need my contact info, it will all be at the end, so you don't have to decide if I'm interesting yet. And really feel free to reach out to me. It's kind of like they were talking about in the panel. Like, everybody wants to talk in the community and everything. I love answering questions. It makes me feel important. I'm currently a front-end engineer at Drone Deploy. We do automation of drone flights and aerial imagery. I kind of touched on it in the panel. And so I work on a mobile app that we build to native. Not too long ago, I was at ClearVoice, one of our sponsors. So thank you to ClearVoice and the other sponsors. Thank you in particular to Jeff from ClearVoice, who encouraged me to go speak. But anyway, so scope of today's talk, just because there are a lot of expectations when it comes to style guides, I think in particular. I'm not going to teach how to use any one specific style guide tool or really how to decide all the content that needs to go into it. I'm not going to talk about branding. It's going to be some similar stuff to what you might have heard before lunch. But I'm going to talk about why we're all weird, all of us that are here, why the phrase self-document in code is ridiculous, and how you can work incrementally towards using a lifestyle guide, because odds are you have to sell the value of any added thing. And I'm going to talk about how you can actually start working towards it. So a little bit more about who I am, a little bit of my background. If I had to describe myself in one sentence, this would not be that sentence. I am a PhD dropout. I spent about 2 months pursuing a PhD in computer science, and I quit because I wanted to focus on UX issues. I started out after that as a JavaScript consultant, so front end, specifically very engineering front end. And I've always kind of liked behavioral psych and behavioral econ, that sort of thing. So really what I care about most is people. I love engineering, but I more love the people aspect of it. So why should you trust me? Why should you place your trust in me? Well, for this topic in particular, I actually worked on developing a lifestyle guide generator. This was from a bit ago. I'm not going to specifically recommend you go use document CSS. Tools will depend on your teams and your need. But also designers love me. So I don't know, not every engineer. Designers don't love every engineer. If you want proof of that, and you also are curious why I keep trying to peddle this guy's book, that's Tom Griever. I used to work with him. So who are you, though? So who are you and who are we together? So in articulating design decisions, Tom Griever talks about the role of UX and how it's been changing. And this is actually true of all of us on interdisciplinary teams that have designers and engineers and just front end in general, back end if you deal with front end and deal with product and process and that sort of thing. So we're kind of finding these new roles. We're finding ourselves in these new team environments and new challenges as people are more educated about UX and that sort of thing. And I mean, designers are now when someone says they're a designer, it doesn't mean anything on its own, because you have people who call themselves designers that just learned a little bit of Photoshop recently, and then you have highly technical people who call themselves designers, and I've just been thrilled the more designers have been able to be involved in an engineering process. So we've kind of got a mix of engineer designers, designer engineers, and what makes this kind of weird is that we aren't just analytical or just intuitive. We have to walk that line. We're both intuitive and analytical. And that's really hard to walk the line between those two things because you're stuck with a feeling about what should be right in a lot of cases, but you're also stuck with the responsibility of feeling like you have to articulate it in an objective way. So we're kind of, I really feel like a lot of problems in engineering process come from a lot of engineers, a lot of computer science oriented people come from this mindset that it's even possible to be objective. So I think part of what makes us weird, often people who just go to conferences at all because they care about communicating and learning can make people a little weird. But what makes people who care about something like CSS, design-oriented things, weird is we kind of do have to step towards this idea of meeting people where they are and not just believing that the way we feel is objectively right. So what we end up doing is we don't just think, we don't just have opinions, we actually have to think about thinking. It's called metacognition. And actually, this is like a common thread that's been running through some of these talks today. So this, when you think about process, you're kind of thinking about metacognition. When you kind of think about whether you can even immediately trust your opinions, that's metacognition when you're evaluating yourself. So like, we have to step back from objectivity. And we have to even recognize that our opinions can be intuitive, our opinions can be analytical, but we can't trust them the way a lot of firmly objective feeling people kind of push their decisions forward. But we do have to deal with it. That's the thing. So we ultimately care deeply about something that a lot of people think of as a joke. And yes, this is funny. I'm not going to pretend that's not funny. But it was way funnier when designers used it than when people who don't use CSS started using it. So like early days of CSS, when there was a lot of this going on. So actually, I just want to go ahead and take care of that. We can just get rid of that one. And of course, nobody's perfect. We all make jokes about CSS sometimes. But the issue is not, getting offended whether it's funny, whatever. There's this Twitter account that whenever you say these people, it retweets you, so you can it reminds you when you say these people that those people are people also. But anyway, thought it was just funny. But the problem here is, like I was kind of saying in the panel, they're the ones that are doing a lot of writing the rules now. I mean, the single page app frameworks are seriously gaining ground, and Angular 2 and React both are becoming very opinionated about the way style should be done. And I actually had a conversation about some of the direction these are headed with someone on my team, and they said, well, isn't this just the way it's going? And they sent me a couple links to blog posts. And none of those blog posts were written by people who even a majority of their work involves design working with CSS. This is all engineers kind of trying to circumvent some of the problems that CSS tries to solve, instead of like learning a way that's kind of good to solve it. And that's not everybody, but the thing is, what's scary is if we aren't stepping in, they're kind of writing the rules. So what? So I haven't actually really said anything yet. If you've been paying attention, I didn't need to tell you that. But I'm going to talk about what I mean when I say lifestyle guide, why I think you should want one on your team, and how you can actually start implementing one iteratively. So I'm going to talk about living versus live, and I really believe that specificity is the soul of good communication. I don't know if anyone ever watched Middleman, but living versus live. What do I mean when I say live instead of living? So we can look at Tig Notaro. So this is Tig Notaro in her show One Mississippi. This is living. This is Tig Notaro live. All right, and it's actually from Live by Tig Notaro. But anyway, there's a difference between living and live. I think a lot of the time when people say a living document, it's actually one of these weird things where they believe that it's a statement of values against the reality. So usually when someone says, at the top of a doc, if you've ever seen a Google Doc that starts out with the words, this is a living document, it's probably stale. Because that's them begging everyone to keep it alive. It's usually when people say living document, it means this document is on life support. So when I say lifestyle guide, there are like 3 specific things that I'm kind of defining for what I think an ideal lifestyle guide is. One is it's based on existing code, so sort of like if you saw in the session right before lunch, pulling stuff out of existing code and generating a guide based on that. Little easier in just kind of more static work, like more static HTML and CSS pages. But if you have, for instance, a single page app framework and you have components in that framework that you're trying to document, a lifestyle guide takes the code that you're using for those components, and everything it demos based on those components comes directly from that code. So you're not creating a new document somewhere else. It's getting generated from the code that already exists. I had a teacher once that said, you shouldn't ever put something up on the board and then draw an X through it, because people just remember the thing before it had the X through it. So I always like to put an X first. So I don't want, like, the sort of traditional approach, and one that's, thank goodness, changing, is you'd have a style guide and then you'd use that to inform reality. But what we really want is we want our reality to be reflected in our style guide. And I'll kind of get to why that's important in a bit. Second is it needs to, so that's the bare minimum. Like really the bare minimum for me, who, there's not an official definition for lifestyle guide yet, I don't think. But to me, like the bare minimum is it's got to come from existing code. A good lifestyle guide will update automatically when your code does. And a great style guide, I really think, builds to a static site, even if your web application relies on a ton of data. A really good style guide will take components out of your app and build into a static site with demos that all have like mocked data within that. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's important in a bit. So that was something that we originally built document CSS at the consulting shop I worked at to solve a few particular problems with clients, communicating certain things, sharing consistency on different components between developers. Document CSS is actually, it doesn't exist. Document.js is the actual tool. Document CSS is just a website that documents the parts that matter to someone just trying to do a lifestyle guide. So just to recap, comes from existing code, builds automatically, hopefully, builds to a static site, hopefully. So it's not just documentation, it's more than just documentation. And this is kind of why I really, really believe that a lifestyle guide or something moving towards using a lifestyle guide will be valuable almost always. Self-documenting code is nonsense. I'm going to talk about why up-to-date is better than ideal, and how you can harness creativity by constraining it. I was so happy to hear constraints in, I think, 2 talks earlier today. I love hearing people talk about how constraints are good. That's like my favorite thing. So self-documenting code. Nonsense. When you hear self-documenting code, it's nonsense. There's no, code does not document itself. And you can definitely work towards it. But usually when people are talking about how code should be self-documenting, it's a huge problem, because when we write code, we aren't immediately thinking about documentation. Our #1 task is to solve the problem in front of us. And then later we might think about how we're going to document. Communicating is just not a primary task for most programmers. That's the problem. That's just the way it is. We're not trying to accomplish communication, which is what self-documenting code purportedly does. It communicates what something is doing without any other assistance. This is out of so I focused on usability and security back when I was doing research. This is from a paper on usable security. And we have the same problem in security, that when you have difficult tasks for security, users will find ways to work around it, because security is just a supporting task. It's not their primary task. It's not the thing that they want to accomplish. Similarly, developers, we don't want to communicate primarily to the next person reading our code, even if the next person who reads our code is us. And so part of this, I really had to try not to dig too deeply into cognitive systems, because that's really actually all I ever want to talk about. But just like quick breakdown of one way of thinking about cognitive systems. We have type 1 and type 2 systems. We have our automatic system, which is very fast, which if you've ever like swerved in traffic for a moment and you didn't feel like you thought through that, that's your automatic system. And it's there for a reason. It's there for survival. It's there because it'd be exhausting if we had to like think deeply every day. System 2 is when we slow down and make complex decisions. I think like the most popular book that talks about this is Thinking Fast and Slow. So the problem is we primarily try to work in system 2, but we often forget that the next person to see code, the next person to read code, even if it's us, is going to be in system 1. We also forget that as soon as we open a pull request, we're now going to be in system 1 about our code by default. When people give feedback, like I mean, hopefully this isn't just me like admitting something that's only about me. But once you open a PR, I really feel like your goal is to get it done at that point. And so we stop thinking about it. The first time other people are reading our code, we now stop thinking about how our code communicates. That's scary. But documenting your code, documenting your work is essentially articulating design decisions. Continue plugging this book, but really we should really view documentation as articulating our design decisions. So if we really want to write self-documenting code, that's fine, but you should view the self-documenting part as everything without any additional work or communication is a defense of why you made that choice. And that's why I think like it's almost impossible to write totally self-documenting code, because even if something makes sense, it's really hard to communicate value while someone's also reading something for the direct functionality of it. Oh gosh. Okay, so the other thing is done's better than perfect. So part of why I say a style guide should come from code that exists already is for this reason exactly. But I really think more so, in this case, available is better than best practices. So the problem a non-lifestyle guide comes with, or even one, and this is why I think lifestyle guide coming directly from code, even broken code, even code that's ugly, is still a good thing, because accessible is still going to be better than best practices. I really think part of the reason that Bootstrap took off is because of code snippets. But it's available, it's accessible, it's easy to copy and paste. What is a common heuristic for figuring out standards when you're working with the code base you're new to? Looking at another file, copying and pasting it. So you're not actually going to do any worse than people are already doing by documenting your less than ideal standards. But it being there in the first place means you're going to have consistency. And that's like a little better than inconsistent, terrible code that needs cleaning up. So one thing I also want us to think about is we do so much of our communication in formats where we throw it away. Like we don't keep a lot of the talk about why we chose to do something a certain way, or even the way we agreed to do it. If someone is new to your team and you're trying to explain standards to them as you're reading through code, you've had that discussion already. You probably argued about it already. Where is it? It's gone. Also, we have, once again, on PRs, we have a lot of the discussions about our code after we've already decided what we want it to look like. And so I guess what I'm getting at here is, in the same way that a really good test isn't one that passes all the time, a really good test is one that fails. Good documentation makes failure obvious and apparent. So really good documentation doesn't show the ideal and ignore the reality. Good documentation helps the reality float up. And you can either continue using that reality and live with it, or you can use it as an incentive to change it. Oh goodness. I cannot for the life of me remember why I put Oh, Aristotle. Aristotelian tragedy. Like the classic tragedy involves a character who is more or less good and identifiable but has a tragic flaw, and through a little bit of his flaw meets his downfall. But it's important that he kind of had it coming, that he was good enough to identify with so we don't feel like he deserves it, so it's tragic, but he's not such a jerk that we don't care that something bad happened to him. Though Othello is like weirdly the example of that, and he was like a huge jerk. But anyway, my point here is so what makes us good engineers also can make us really bad engineers. So our tragic flaw is also one of our biggest strengths. We chase solutions very fast. We build very quickly. And so this is when we're talking about constraining things, this is actually part of what I'm trying to harness, is creativity within constraints. So I know that was a lot to throw at you. But just like an example of creativity within constraints, if you've ever read dinosaur comics, you probably can't read that at all, that's fine. But it's the same art every day and just different text, different formats. Sometimes he'll have God talk from above. But somebody asked him, how do you do that? And he said, I don't know how anybody writes a webcomic without doing this, because he's so built into creativity within constraints. And then one of the constraints we really want to shoot for is designers should be able to make changes to our application, make changes where they kind of know best. And I think that's a really important constraint to put on, and I'm going to talk about how a lifestyle guide can actually help you do that. And finally, part of the why here, secret to building large apps is never build large apps. So what I'm going to talk about with some of the stuff you have to do with your app to move towards a lifestyle guide is really stuff that you should be doing anyway. So I kind of talked a lot vaguely about why, like the behavioral reasons and stuff, why I think that you're going to want a lifestyle guide. But let's tie it all together and actually use one. So man, just can't read text on there, can you? Anyway, Dewey's saying we don't need a school in our little society. Everybody's born smart. Hal says, oh, that's great. It's a utopia. So, Dewey says, and anyone who's not smart gets ground up for food. So when we talk about an ideal project is there's no real ideal project. So actually, I did make I'm not going to read through every point of this, but as I talk about some specific things for how to approach building a lifestyle guide in an existing project, there are some specifics that I think are important, and I made this checklist, and it's on my website at that URL down there. I'll have the website again at the end. You can go back to talk, whatever. But this is a checklist that I think actually serves as a very good guide for what you can move towards. So there's kind of 3 different pieces to it: demo pages or example pages, depending on what you want to call it. The actual generation of the style guide and how you actually host that style guide. So I'm going to talk first heavily about demo pages and what that involves and why I think they're the most important piece of this, and then talk about 2 other things to kind of be aware of. But once again, this is your checklist for later as you're going through, as you're trying to work towards building a style guide. Here are discrete steps, but I'm going to talk about some pitfalls rather than going through setup. So this is kind of what what one version of generating a style guide can look like. You have just tags. It's just regular documentation. But what you see with iframe. So this iframe thing here is populating in an actual demo page, a standalone demo page, and you see this a lot with CSS-heavy style guides, but in a complicated app, what we actually want to do is, for components that we call reusable, we actually want to take those and also put those in a demo page. And so there are 2 things that this sort of helps us do. We use existing code like I said we wanted to earlier, but we're making constraints real. So basically, when I say a demo page, what I'm really talking about, the ideal demo page for every piece of your app that you call reusable, and really, ideally, even sub-pages that you're only using once, it is a static HTML page that you have built, compiled JavaScript, all your CSS, whatever, just like you would for the app, and built that to a static HTML page, but you're not allowed to use a backend. So you can fake data for it, you can mock up data for it, you can use, there are all kinds of tools out there where you can even simulate HTTP responses, but it's really important that those demo pages don't rely on the backend. Part of the reason for that is if you're maintaining a testable code base, you should already be able to do that. And I would say that if you're not already mocking out stuff for a lot of your components, you are working around, you're like actually avoiding testing your app, like in its real set. I don't know, if you've ever looked at like an Angular testing code base, like ours right now is such a mess. We have mocks everywhere. Services are mocked everywhere. But so I'm talking about using this goal of having demo pages partially as a way of working towards a particular process. So there's this talk, if you're a designer, if you're more UX side of things and you're thinking about design process, this post is really good. It's about specifically how you can use how you can use style guides to inform your development process and like as prototyping steps and communicating with stakeholders. But there are these kind of 4 steps. And I think developers have a lot to learn about development approach from the design process. Because really we're talking about trying to do sort of the same things. We're discovering, we're abstracting, we're implementing, and then we're integrating. And really what we want to do as designers, or as developers, I feel this very strongly, is we want to create a demo page with the bare minimum of what we need. If a component requires data, we've mocked out that data, so we've had to think about what that data looks like, how that's plugged into it. If you're trying to design a reusable component, how do you get data into, for instance, a dumb component like in Angular? You might pass it in via an attribute. But so much of the work that becomes kind of a nightmare later, that can get in the way of testability later, that can be really hard to work with later, gets brought to the surface in this first step if you actually do the first step of discovery. So your demo page, your first step of your demo page is not fully functional component. It's the bare minimum that you're going to have to do if you're like most developers that say they do TDD and actually wait till the end to write all their tests. You work within the app itself and then you write tests. You're going to do all that at the end when you're trying to test it anyway. But this is going to actually make you think of that, about how it fits into the application on its own, in isolation. It's also going to help you isolate your concerns, like what problem are you trying to solve. So I really think that these are things we should be doing, and this is like a really thoughtful, or a really helpful thought process to get to. So once you have your bare minimum there, you can actually start writing tests, because you sort of know like the shape of the component, so you can even start writing functional tests. You shouldn't write all your tests before you start writing other code. Like I think that extreme degree of test-driven development is kind of silly. But you can actually think about testability at this point, because you're not thinking in the abstract of the problem you're trying to solve. You actually have part of your API for your component built out already. And then you can implement the rest of the functionality. And then once you integrate it, I think you'll be really surprised at how easy it is to integrate it. Odds are whatever data a component needs can be passed down to it from a parent. And if you've got ugly Angular stuff going on, it's not that hard to do like a wrapper component that passes in data using a service. But the point is, like, when we skip this, we skip some really valuable learning. So in a way, getting towards a lifestyle guide and using a lifestyle guide, I think one of the really valuable steps of it is it starts forcing you to do this as part of your development process. I think if you've never done this before, once you start trying it, that's going to be how you start developing components. Like, it's so much fun. There's no like long rebootstrapping or anything, or refreshing the page. So use demo pages. That's what I'm kind of trying to get at here. However, when you're trying to, this kind of goes back to earlier, don't over-engineer. When you're first trying to set up like a lifestyle guide, don't try to over-automate it. Automation is all about scaling. So like at first, when you're trying to set something up, really good automation saves you from a lot of config, from a lot of boilerplate. And it's actually OK early on in something as you're getting something set up to move quickly on it, kind of like building a one-off page. But also, there's a little bit of mind control to this, because here's the other little sneaky thing that I think a good lifestyle guide can help you do in your code base. If you don't try to use like sneaky or like fancy glob selectors and try to do all this like fancy file processing where you try to find every file that you've started documenting and automatically find every demo page, you're going to find yourself manually writing some configuration. And depending on the tool you're using to generate your site, even if you're using something like, say, Jekyll, so document CSS is kind of similar to Jekyll. They both generate a static site. You're now thinking about how to communicate the architecture of your app, like how things are divided, how components are divided. You have like some shared stuff, some page level stuff, subcomponents. You're actually now organizing in your head as you're configuring a lifestyle guide how you can communicate everything in your application, which is something that you should have been doing when you were organizing your files. But this is kind of I think this is a really common like Angular file structure. It's our Angular file structure right now. We have a common, we have components. Everything's in components, and then we have sidebar, and almost everything's in sidebar. Like that's crazy. What's in there? But if you start actually thinking about file structure in the way in like how you are communicating to someone new to the code base, you're going to kind of organize it differently. And so instead of trying to pick a tool that does a lot of really fancy stuff for you, you can even like do a little too much work at the start without automating stuff, because it's going to force you to start thinking about how your actual code organization matches up to how you communicate about it. And then finally, like when you're actually getting stuff together, don't be afraid to just get stuff done and do stuff messy. So I talk about like ideal demo page stuff. This is for documentcss.com. So document CSS uses document.js to build a style guide for documentcss.com as an example in the documentation of documentcss.com. So that if you think that was like hard to follow, it was really confusing doing that. Like we learned a lot from it, but it was really confusing when you're making a documentation tool. Yeah, documenting your documentation tool with the documentation tool, all of a sudden like C compilers written in C aren't that crazy to me. But so this is actually like a weird hacky way that I even set up demo pages for documentcss.com. So you have page elements in document CSS that sort of generate to individual pages, and you manually designate parents. So that's kind of like what I was talking about with thinking about file structure, and you manually set up a lot of the organization. But I actually like set up a separate site that gets generated with a brand new template that's just for demo pages that inserted the CSS for those demo pages. So that's really hacky. You should not be afraid to do that. It like kind of stupid things when you're trying to work in a code base you're already in. And this sort of goes, if you're in consulting, moving from client to client a lot, moving from project to project a lot, you do want to think about standardizing it. If you're kind of on a longer term project, don't be afraid to start out a little stupid. And then even in that I'm working on right now, like for us to define demo pages, I wanted to get it down to one file for people to be able to create a demo page. So you just make a demo.ts and define a new component in it. And I think we took a similar approach at Clear Voice. Yeah, okay. Bryce set it up over there. It was awesome. But yeah, so this is kind of a hacky way to do it. Now the downside of this is it doesn't actually build to static page, but really just kind of get it done. Wait, where am I going? Okay, so I feel like I missed a slide. Okay. So, and just remember that you're probably building it internally first, and it's okay if it's messy. And people actually do like it once you get it up. It's like one of the weirdest things once you get a lifestyle guide going that takes code comments and builds them to pages and takes demos and builds them into static pages. Like people start documenting stuff. It's really super weird, and people like it enough that even with a like kind of crappy build system, people will deal with it. People will be patient with it because really, it makes development more fun. But also stakeholders will love it. It's really easy to argue the value of it. But just step back to where was I stepping back to? Sorry. checklist. That's what I wanted to go back to. So don't think I put another copy of that. So to kind of tie that all into the actual steps, like you have your demo pages, which I think is your first step moving towards being able to do lifestyle guides, especially in a dynamic code base. If you don't have a dynamic code base, that's actually a lot easier to do. The actual generator for that creates your style guide site, and then your deployment path. So I don't really, I didn't even talk much about how to use document CSS or document JS or what it looks like, because I don't actually want to like push a specific tool on you. I think there are a few options out there if you search for style guide generators. I actually also don't, at this point, necessarily advise using document CSS just because it's not like in that of active development. I'm excited for, what's the name? Herman. I'm excited for that. Check it out. But yeah, so the important thing is that you're able to, in your code comment, or in comments in your code, or in Markdown files, be able to make declarations like you would for JS doc. If you've ever done any sort of automated documentation building, it looks a lot like that. What makes it different is the demos. Like you need to have demos, or it's not really a lifestyle guide. The other thing is don't use a best practices document. Throw that away. But start with demos, then worry about your generator, then worry about your deployment. And deployment isn't all that important, but if somebody on your team really enjoys DevOps, having them like use a Git hook or a GitHub hook, or the web hook from GitHub, sorry, to automatically build and deploy a static site that you can look at online anytime you like make a merge into master. It's really cool. It keeps stakeholders up to date, that sort of thing. But demo pages. Oh, right. I gotta go with. All right. Yeah. So use demo pages. That's like, once again, my number one thing. If you're trying to communicate, how your app looks and how your app is organized and how different components look, and be able to actually demonstrate high fidelity prototypes to stakeholders, to teammates, a style guide's a great way to do it. And having a reference up where everyone can see it, even an imperfect one for code snippets, up where everyone can see it, will be valuable. But really, if you do nothing else, towards lifestyle guide, like I really think you should give the demo page thing a shot. That's close to self-documenting code too. But yeah, so I know I kind of zipped through that, and I actually didn't want to get too much into like the specifics of building a lifestyle guide, because I didn't want to be boring. But if y'all have questions, if I've lost some of y'all, if the idea of a style guide is new to you, like I'm kind of interested to hear like what else you're wondering here.